This lesson is going to be focused on how gases are transported throughout the body via the bloodstream. Keywords for this lesson, again, we're going to be discussing erythrocytes and not the other components of blood. We'll be looking at hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin, a molecule called carbaminohemoglobin, that really is a word, oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. We'll also be talking about bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. Learning objectives for this lesson are as follows. Please make sure that you are able to describe the composition of blood and understand how gas exchange works. So we're going to go back to looking at erythrocytes. So remembering these are red blood cells. Red blood cells, or erythrocytes, are chiefly to do with the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide around the body. We remember that red blood cells have a biconcave shape, and that gives them a large surface area for the transport of oxygen because they can pack lots of hemoglobin into their internal area. The reason for that is because they lack a nucleus and some other key organelles, which means that they can get more hemoglobin in there. Now, hemoglobin has a quaternary structure, so that means it has 4 parts to it of that protein, and in each section of protein there is a heme group, which means that it has an iron core. And this is what gives hemoglobin a high affinity for oxygen. Now what that means is that it will bind really well with oxygen. If you look at this diagram here of hemoglobin, again with that quaternary structure, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and these little yellow discs are the heme groups. We can see that when it's in its deoxygenated state, so that's low oxygen, we tend to give things a blue colour. When oxygen combines with hemoglobin, we say that the hemoglobin is now oxyhemoglobin, and you can see that we have oxygen bound to this molecule because hemoglobin, of course, has a high affinity. So remembering, hemoglobin is found in erythrocytes. When we have oxygen combining with hemoglobin, we form oxyhemoglobin, and this molecule is really useful in the human body because not only does oxygen associate readily with hemoglobin, it will also dissociate, and that means it will give up that oxygen to surrounding tissues. Now, seems to be a lot going on here, but if we break this down into steps, we can see that oxygen, as we said in the previous slide, will combine with hemoglobin to make oxyhemoglobin. So when you cut yourself and you see a little blob of blood, it's usually bright red in colour, and that is showing that there is a lot of oxygen in that blood. Where would we find oxygen-rich blood? We'd probably find it in highest concentration here at the alveoli. So we can see on the graph, when we're at the alveoli, we have the highest concentration of oxygen. As we move down this curve, we are moving away from the alveoli and towards respiring tissues. So as we go from the lungs right around the body, we are dropping off oxygen as we go until we end up with no more oxygen in the red blood cells, and we go back to the alveoli for more. So this process of hemoglobin combining with oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin in the alveoli, this can be reversed, and oxygen bound to the hemoglobin forming oxyhemoglobin can dissociate to form hemoglobin on its own and oxygen, which will diffuse into respiring cells. This is a quick video that you may want to watch that describes the oxygen and hemoglobin dissociation curves. This isn't necessary for the course, but if you're interested and you'd like to know more about how that works, this is a really good video to watch. So now we're going to be looking at how carbon dioxide is carried in the red blood cells. Carbon dioxide can be carried in three ways. The first one is dissolved in the blood plasma. So if this is a blood capillary, the plasma is the space in between the erythrocytes. This is that straw-coloured fluid. And you'll notice that only about 8% is dissolved in that plasma. Now, this isn't high volume of carbon dioxide, and we'll explain why that's the case in a moment. The next highest concentration of carbon dioxide is actually transported as carbaminohemoglobin. So therefore carbon dioxide attaches to hemoglobin, and that's about 22%. The remainder, which is bicarbonate ions, which you can see here, this is how the majority of carbon dioxide is transported throughout the bloodstream. So it's a little bit of chemistry, and we're going to explain how that occurs. So when we look at this, we're seeing a lot of chemical equations going on, but we're just going to break it down into little bits. So we know that the metabolic wastes produced by cells in respiration are carbon dioxide and water. Now, when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, just like fizzy drinks and soda streams, we get an acid forming, and that acid is carbonic acid. Now, we don't want our blood to become acidic. That can be dangerous. It can lead to a condition called blood acidosis, and we know that enzymes in our body cells do not function out with their pH range, and it can denature them. Carbonic acid is also not very stable, and it will then break down to form hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So what we're really showing here is that carbon dioxide and water join together to form a substance that isn't very stable. That substance, which happens to be an acid, will break apart, and it won't be forming carbon dioxide and water. We get hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. So this is just a little summary of what we've talked about so far. Now, through constant ventilation, which of course is breathing in and out, we maintain balance, which we refer to in biology as homeostasis, by getting rid of that excess carbon dioxide, because we really don't want to have too much acid in our blood at any one time. Now, carbon dioxide will eventually diffuse out of the alveoli as carbon dioxide gas, not as bicarbonate ions, but it has to get to the alveoli first. So the respiring tissue will produce carbon dioxide. This will diffuse from a high concentration in the cells to a lower concentration into the red blood cells, and this forms carbaminohemoglobin. Remembering, about 8% of that carbon dioxide will go into the blood plasma, and about 70% will form bicarbonate ions. Now, it's important that you remember these percentages. It's worthwhile understanding that, because then it will help you to remember how each of these are transported around the body. For this course, you don't need to be able to write out the chemical equation. However, it can help you to remember and understand what's going on. If your chemistry isn't strong, just understanding the word equation is fine. Okay, so just a quick summary of how carbon dioxide is transported around the body. So we can see in this diagram we have deoxygenated blood coloured in grey and oxygenated blood in this pink colour. So these grey spheres are representing carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide will come to the alveolar side of the capillary, and we get diffusion of carbon dioxide from high to low concentration. what is happening here is that some of this carbon dioxide, which is dissolved in the blood plasma, will diffuse straight across, remembering that gases will diffuse very well when they're in that dissolved state. Carbaminohemoglobin, remembering this is how about 22% of carbon dioxide is transported through the red blood cells. That reaction will reverse, so it will form hemoglobin, which stays in the red blood cells, and the carbon dioxide will be released and it will again diffuse into the alveolar space. And lastly, the hydrogen ions and the bicarbonate ions will recombine. We will then work backwards from this equation here. We will form carbonic acid, which will then break down to water and oxygen, which we also breathe out. So this cartoon is a summary of what's happening. So hopefully you should be able to follow what's going on now, even though it does seem a little bit busy. So again, we'll start off with the blood plasma. That carbon dioxide just simply diffuses across into the alveolar space. The carbaminohemoglobin, which transports carbon dioxide, breaks down to hemoglobin, that's the Hb, plus carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide will diffuse into the alveolar space. And then lastly, the bicarbonate ions and the hydrogen ions will recombine to form carbonic acid, which will then break down into water and carbon dioxide. And again, we have diffusion for the carbon dioxide and osmosis for the water, moving from high concentration here to a lower concentration here. Okay, so this diagram is from your textbook and it's a good summary of what happens throughout the body. So up here, these are the alveoli, and down here we have body cells, and we can see it's a constant loop of association and dissociation of oxygen with hemoglobin, and similarly with carbon dioxide and hemoglobin in the other direction. So just to summarize this lesson, we've noted that red blood cells, or erythrocytes, have a biconcave structure. The reason for this is to increase the oxygen carrying capacity of the cells. They don't have a nucleus or some other organelles, and that is simply to make room for more hemoglobin. We know that hemoglobin is a respiratory pigment found in red blood cells, and its job is to assist in the transportation of oxygen and carbon dioxide from the lungs to respiring tissues around the body. We also know that when oxygen combines with hemoglobin, we form oxyhemoglobin, and when carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin, we form carbaminohemoglobin. Key point about hemoglobin is that it has a high affinity for oxygen, which means that it always wants to bind with it. However, another really useful property is that it will readily dissociate from hemoglobin. So oxygen will associate and dissociate from hemoglobin when necessary. We now understand that carbon dioxide is transported in 3 ways in the bloodstream. 8% is dissolved in blood plasma, 22% as carbaminohemoglobin, so attached to hemoglobin in red blood cells, but the majority, so that's about 70%, is formed as bicarbonate ions, which are transported in the plasma around the body. Now, when these bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions get to the alveolar area, they will recombine to form carbonic acid, which will then break down to form water and carbon dioxide, which is then breathed out in the normal process of ventilation. Okay, so that's the end of this lesson. Please make sure that you go back and read pages 105 to 107 of your textbook. There's a lot of information here. Make sure that you understand it. Please make sure that you also complete pages 19 to 21 of your class booklet and make notes that will help you to summarize this content.